Hi, everybody. So, the next three topics are part of a series. They are called If You Want Blood, Physical Symptoms, and the Forgiveness of Physical Symptoms. Each one can be listened to or watched individually, but they are as a whole meant as a series, one kind of building on the other. And the first segment is called If You Want Blood, You Got It. Ken, a lot of times, starts his workshops with some classical music theme or Shakespeare to get into the topic. I thought the 1978 AC/DC album, If You Want Blood, would be a good starting point. So I was a huge AC/DC fan in my teens, and I still think it's one of the finest rock bands of all time. And I chose this title not only because I think it's catchy, but I think it's true, and in the coarse sense, not as gory. The course is not as gory most of the time, but it is in line with one of the lines in the course that says, "The secret of salvation is but this, that you are doing this unto yourself." And that's in chapter 27, section 8, paragraph 10. The secret of salvation is but this, that you are doing this unto yourself. So, we can combine the two statements, bringing AC/DC into the course, and we could say that the secret of salvation is but this: if you want blood, you've got it. Anyway, so before we get into the discussion of our topic, I wanted to discuss the question, who is the you that Jesus addresses in the course? I think it's very important to, especially for this series of those three segments, because it can get a little dicey if we think that us as the person doing this to ourselves, which is not the case, right? So it's important to note that Jesus never talks to us as the person reading this course. And that's already a little mind-boggling, right? But the one that thinks he or she lives inside this body, with eyes that read the words or with ears that listen, is not the one Jesus is talking to when he talks to us in the first person. Jesus always talks to the decision maker. And the decision maker is the part of our mind that has chosen the ego and is now identified with Stefan or a certain personality, a certain puppet. The question a lot of times is asked in Ken's workshops, who is the decision maker? And there's this confusion of who am I in regard to the decision maker? In one sense, we are the decision maker, but we're just not in touch with that. So trying to understand that we are the decision maker, but at the same time we're not the decision maker, is a little bit confusing and challenging, right? Because it kind of generates a little bit of a gap in understanding the material, because who is the one that is grasping the concepts of the course if it's not us as the person? So I wanted to just discuss that for a little bit and hopefully be clear enough to make sense. So how I understand it is that the pure, I'm going to say, the pure unclouded decision maker is the part of the Son's mind that just after the tiny mad idea happened, decided for the ego and against the Holy Spirit. And from there, the decision maker listened to the ego, who told the decision maker this tale of, you killed God and that's sinful. And not only have you sinned, but you are a sin. And the guilt that came from that was tremendous, that the ego told the decision maker to project out. We projected it onto God, which made God the murderer instead of us. And then we were afraid of God. We were afraid that God would take back the life that we supposedly stole from him. And then the ego tells the decision maker that is now already no longer this unclouded decision maker, but has now taken on this self that is sinful and this overwhelming burden of guilt and this incredible fear of God. And we, as the decision maker, now split into billions of tiny little parts. We make the world, and we are now identified with one of the figures in this dream. And we have forgotten that we're not here. We have forgotten that we're still in the mind, just projecting one tiny little parcel into this figure that we now call whatever we call ourselves. So we are still the decision maker, but we are now, in a way, we buried ourselves, and the Course talks about this, we buried ourselves under layers and layers and layers and layers of defenses, individuality, sin, guilt, fear, projection, the mind, then the world, and the same thing happens again with guilt, projection, fear of attack, defenses, special love, special hate relationships. But we are still the decision maker. Just if you can think of it, I always think of it as the decision maker that isn't right in the head. It's kind of like we are the decision maker, but our mind is in a haze. We can't think straight. We think people are responsible for how we feel, right? We just can't think straight because the clouds of guilt. But we are still always the decision maker. So the process of the Course, mostly through forgiveness and the miracle, is now to slowly make it up the ladder, as the Course says, up the ladder, separation let you down. That's the process of the Course, to get back up to that point where we are unclouded in the mind, and from there we can make another choice. So that's the process of the Course. But but we're never not the decision maker, and it is not Stefan or whoever we are that Jesus addresses when he says the secret of salvation is but this, that you are doing this unto yourself. Stefan is not doing anything to himself, right? Or we are not doing anything to ourselves as the person. But as the decision maker, we are, because we have made the world, right? We have made all those scenarios that we now experience. Basically, forgiveness is the one thing that lifts the veil, that stands in between us and us realizing or becoming fully aware that we are the decision maker, right? There's a reason why we have separated our awareness from the decision maker, because we're afraid. The fear is what makes our mind clouded with guilt. We're clouded. So there's a seeming distance between us and the awareness of us being the decision maker. So, now, the ego's goal for us is mindlessness, right? We covered that already. But let's just quickly go through it again, because it's important to get that and then apply the correction that we're talking about. So the ego needs us to be mindless. And we are afraid of our mind. So this is like a match made in heaven, right? The ego's need for us to be mindless and our fear of going back to our mind. That's why the ego tells us this whole story, of sin and guilt, so that we leave the mind, right? So we're so afraid of the mind. That's why we become mindless. So we are afraid of the mind, and the ego wants us mindless. So those fit perfectly together. It's a match made in heaven, basically. Jesus talks about special love relationships as a match made in heaven. But I also think that the ego's need for us to be mindless and our fear of the mind is a perfect match in that moment. We are afraid of the power of the mind because we think we used that power to kill God. That is extremely important to realize, that we are so afraid of the power of our mind that we deny it with any means possible. We even made a brain that now thinks, that we think it thinks, that is now what we call the mind. But this brain has no influence on anything other than deciding within the illusion, right? So those two things are a perfect match, because as long as we're afraid of the power of the mind, while the ego needs us to be mindless, we won't go back to the mind and decide again for the Holy Spirit. We just won't, right? Because we're too afraid of the power of the mind. And the ego will not change. For the ego will stay 100% the ego. The ego always needs us to be mindless. That's its thing. It doesn't survive without our choice. So it needs us to be mindless. This aspect will not change. The only one that can change is us as the decision-making mind. It's a catch-22 though, because we can't change our mind if first we're not aware that we have a mind, and second, that we are so afraid of the power of our mind. We want to deny the power of our mind at all cost. It's very important to realize that in our lives. And I always talk now up to the decision maker and about the decision maker. So within the process of the Course, one task that Jesus has is to very gently and slowly bring us closer to accepting the power of our mind. That's a tricky thing, because we're so afraid of the power, right? Because we misused it and we think we killed God. We used our power originally to kill God. That is huge. So we never want to touch that power ever again. It's very, very logical, right? That we don't want to touch that power that we think we used to kill God. It's a very normal reaction that we would deny that power with any means necessary. So one way of bringing the power of our mind back to us is to tell us the secret of salvation is that you're doing this unto yourself. Your mind is powerful enough to create all those things in your life. So this seems very hard at first, right? To realize that whatever we experience is up to us. It's a very hard pill to swallow. And that's why it's really important that it's not us as the person, but it's the decision maker in the mind, taking those situations and focusing on those situations, and then saying, I'm not responsible because the outside world made me feel what I feel. I'm not the one that did it. It's a very important survival mechanism of the ego. But because it's our dream, we must at some point realize or take full responsibility for what we encounter. Full responsibility. There's no one that causes anything in our lives other than us, right? As the decision maker. And Jesus says, nothing external to your mind can hurt or injure you in any way. There's no cause beyond yourself that can reach down and bring oppression. No one but yourself affects you. There's nothing in the world that has the power to make you ill or sad or weak or frail. And that's from the workbook, lesson 190. So after hearing this, after reading this paragraph, for example, or that whole lesson, the ego, I think, suddenly at the brink of a massive panic, jumps right in and tells us what a wretched thing we are for screwing up our lives so badly. You know, it tells us that we are attracting those things and causing all those issues in our lives because we are inherently bad. We screwed up again, right? That's the ego's doing, obviously. It basically tells us the same old stuff, that we are sinful and guilty and that we're no good. That's what it told us originally. And now that Jesus tells us, you know, your mind is very powerful and the secret of salvation is that you're doing this unto yourself, the ego jumps right in and hits us over the head and says, yeah, you know, it's all you. You know, you screwed up. You attract those things in your life because you're inherently bad. So, and we believe it, right? We believe the ego. We believed it in the beginning that we're sinful, and we believe it now when Jesus tells us that the secret of salvation is but this, that you're doing this unto yourself. So the reason why we're so afraid of the notion that everything in our lives is our doing is basically twofold. First of all, it reinforces the ego's notion or the ego's belief of our own inadequacy, right? We're just inadequate. I remember Ken talking sometimes about second-class citizen. We're second-class citizens, right? We're inadequate. We are sinful, weak, and as he says, we are completely inadequate. And because we're so inadequate, we're so afraid of that, of the power of our mind. And the second one is, if everything is up to us, right? And I mentioned that just before. If everything we encounter is our doing, that means that our minds are so powerful that we also were able to kill God. And that's what we can't handle. We can't live with that. That's why we need to deny the power of our mind at all cost. And Jesus' answer to that is one sentence. And he says, peace to such foolishness. It's also in the workbook, lesson 190. Same lesson. Peace to such foolishness, because Jesus tells us basically, listen, you don't have to be afraid of your mind. Your ego tells you that it's that it's so powerful that it can kill God, but I'm telling you that you cannot possibly separate from your source. Ideas do not leave their source. We cannot separate from God. Hence, we can't be an individual. We are not sinful, we're not guilty, and we have not killed God. Our mind is not powerful enough to kill God, to destroy heaven. That's the answer that Jesus gives us. The purpose of the course is basically that we're getting out of that victimized mindset that we're powerless and accept that we are the dreamer of the dream, but without fear, right? That's the prerequisite for us, is to be the dreamer of the dream without fear, the unclouded decision maker that then can very clearly make a choice between the ego and the Holy Spirit. The unclouded decision maker. So we project our belief in sin not only onto other people with, for example, with anger. We project it onto the world, and we see it as problems that we have in our lives, conflicts, certain issues, basically whatever robs our peace and keeps us occupied within the world is purposive and our doing. Whatever the outcome for us is, whatever we experience that is caused, quote unquote, by the situation, that is our goal. For example, we have an important meeting and we miss the bus. We feel like we screwed up, right? We're afraid that not getting to the meeting on time will have negative consequences. We might get fired, scolded, etc. Missing the bus is not the issue. The issue is what we feel and think as a result of it. That was what we wanted. When Jesus says, you're doing this unto yourself, it is, we want that feeling we have when we miss the bus. That's the connection. It's not necessarily missing the bus that we made. We made this scenario, but what we want is the feeling that it generates. Missing the bus is just a messenger, but the feeling it generates is we screwed up, we can't be the Son of God, you know, we're afraid of being fired, we lose our job, and whatever the consequences seemingly are, that is what we want. And staying with this example, the ego tells us that we're, for example, afraid of many things in the world, right? One of the things we're afraid of is losing our job. Jesus tells us, however, that we're not afraid of losing our job. We're instead utterly afraid of love. Losing our job is just a smokescreen. Once we realize that all fear is the fear of love, as we discussed in a previous segment, we will naturally come up with less and less situations that will make us believe we're afraid of something in the world. Once we look through the smoke screen of the ego, we don't need those situations anymore, and we will less and less experience them. We might still miss the bus, but we will not think, "Oh my God, I'm afraid I'm gonna lose my job." Because we're not afraid of losing our jobs, we're afraid of love. And once we look through that distraction to the real thing, we don't need the distraction anymore. And Jesus says here, one thing is sure, hallucinations serve a purpose, and when that purpose is no longer held, they disappear. Therefore, the question never is whether you want them, namely missing the bus, for example, but always, do you want the purpose that they serve? What is the purpose of me missing the bus? The purpose of me missing the bus is what I feel after I missed the bus. That was the purpose of it. Lesson 5 says, I'm never upset for the reason I think. So we choose a myriad of scenarios under the ego's guidance that reinforce the belief in us that what we're upset about is something on the outside. We're always upset about something on the outside, right? Our day is filled with being upset or being influenced somehow. Our mood is influenced by something on the outside. Somebody says something, somebody doesn't say something, something happens, we react to it, seemingly. Whatever the situation makes us feel, that's what we wanted. We don't want the symptom necessarily, but we want how it makes us feel. Let's take an example, for example. Let's say we're poor. We don't necessarily want to be poor, but we want the feeling that is associated with it. The experience of lack, the experience of struggle for survival, the sense of not being good enough or being overwhelmed by the tremendous burden we feel. The symptom or the problem is not the issue in this case. It is what the problem or the symptom does to us. That's the issue, and that is our doing. Whatever we think, whatever we feel is so because we did this to ourselves. That feeling is purposive, and that is the secret of salvation. We want the feeling of inadequacy, for example, or lack, or feeling overwhelmed, because that shields us from looking at the underlying guilt, which in turn shields us from the love. So the problem we encounter, the experience we have of being overwhelmed or burdened, we put this in place so we don't have to look at the guilt that underlies it, that in turn shields us from love. So the secret of salvation is that whatever we encounter, however we feel, and whatever we think is our doing, only when we realize that we are the dreamer of the dream and not a dream figure. The dream figure cannot make any decisions to go back to Jesus, right? It's impossible. The dream figure can't make any decisions, but the dreamer can make the decision to stop dreaming once the purpose of the dream is no longer valid. And the purpose of the dream is to shield us from making the decision for back to the Holy Spirit and for God. And as long as we don't want to make that decision to go back, we will be in this dream and we will think we're a dream figure. And we also can't ask Jesus for help if we're a dream figure, right? We can only ask Jesus for help if we are the dreamer of the dream, if we are the decision maker. So ultimately, in order for us to have peace, to be fully at peace, we have to return our mind to God. Right now, our mind is imprisoned in this body, in this person. But we have to return this mind to God. That's the only way we can be at peace. And this happens. We can only return our mind to God if we realize that our mind is benign, that our mind is wholly benign, that it is powerful, but completely benign. And that is the basic quest, the basic goal of the Course, is for us to realize that our mind is benign. And we can learn that our mind is benign by forgiveness. Forgiveness is the process by which we learn that our mind is benign. So the 3 steps that we talked about, the 3 steps of forgiveness, can be applied here as well. The first step is always to state what we're experiencing without spiritualizing it, right? We believe things happen to us, feelings and thoughts come to us without our doing. We believe we are the victim of the world in one shape, form, one shape or form or another. For example, I got fired, I feel betrayed, scary, angry, etc. Right? We state what is, pure and simple. What is? How do I feel? The second step is to realize that the reason why we deny that we are the cause of everything is that because we want to deny the power of our mind. Because we believe that mind is so sinful, that's why we want to deny the power of our mind. I feel the way I feel because I want to feel what I'm feeling. I'm doing this so that I can be innocent. And I'm doing this as a defense against love. The words aren't really that important. It's more to grasp, okay, I'm doing this. And there's a reason I'm doing this. There's a reason I feel the way I feel. There's a reason I feel betrayed, right? Or angry or upset. There's a reason for it. There's a purpose to that. And I put those feelings there to prevent me from something else, to make me innocent and to make me appear that I have no power, that my mind is not powerful, so I can't have possibly killed God. So in step 2, we take back the power. In step 1, we state what is. In step 2, we take back the power. And that's scary, to realize I am doing this to myself. It's not that the world is so powerful. I am powerful. I'm generating all those situations so that I can feel powerless, so that I can feel innocent. The step 2 is we're taking back the power, and it's very, very important to immediately, during that step, asking Jesus for help. Because he is there to assure us that our mind is only powerful enough to make illusions. Our mind is not powerful enough to affect God at all. I always have this image in my head of a child throwing a table tennis ball at the Chrysler building, right? We throw a table tennis ball, tiny little ball, towards the Chrysler building or the Empire State Building, and the child is now afraid that it can bring it down with a table tennis ball. Right? It's standing in a corner, going like this, and afraid it can bring down the Empire State Building with a table tennis ball. So Jesus is there to assure us that our mind is not powerful enough to affect God in any way, shape, or form. Love is not affected at all by this huge, massive machinery that we've taken on. None of it has any effects on God. And he basically goes back, every time we bring something to him, he goes back to the introduction of the course, right? Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. Nothing real can be threatened. Our mind cannot threaten. The mind that we have with the ego cannot threaten God in any way, shape, or form. But before we can go to that, we have to first take the power back and say, I have done this. And I've done this with a purpose. Please help me. And then over time we learn that Jesus tells us, or the Holy Spirit tells us, that there's nothing you can do that can change eternal love. Nothing. Your mind is only powerful within the mind of God. Then you can create. You can use this power to create within the mind of God. But here, in the illusion, your mind is only powerful enough to create other illusions. But all those illusions that you have miscreated, that you thought were so terrible, have had or cannot have any effect on God's love for you. And so the process of the Course, as a last point, the process of the Course for me is, I have this thing in my head where everything we learn with the Course over years and decades, the only reason we learn this is that at the end we can slay the dragon. And I know that might not be a great example, but it's all that, we're going into the darkness of our ego thought system. There's very dark stuff there. It's not real, but we think it's real. We believe it's real. But we're diving deeper and deeper into the ego thought system, all the way to the point where we think we killed God, right? In one way or shape or form, however we experience that. So we're looking at the ego thought system. 50% of the text is looking at the ego thought system. The other 50% of the text are there to bring the light, right? So we're looking at the ego. The ego says, you're the home of evil, darkness, and sin. Lesson 93. And your mind is powerful enough to destroy the oneness of heaven. You are the home of evil, darkness, and sin. We look at that in all the aspects of the ego thought system. Over decades and decades of working with the Course, we look at the ego, we look at everything in the ego, right? But we don't look at it alone. We look at it with Jesus, who says also in lesson 93 that you are your light. What does it say? The light abides in you, basically. That's the header of the lesson. I can't remember. I'm not focusing on the light that much. I'm focusing more on the darkness, I realize. But basically what he says is this: the Son of God can be mistaken, right? He can deceive himself. We can deceive ourselves in many ways. He can even turn the power of his mind against himself, but he cannot sin. There's nothing he can do that would really change his reality in any way, nor make him really guilty. That's Jesus's light that he brings to us looking at the ego. And the secret of salvation is but this, that you are doing this unto yourself, is we look at what we're doing and we realize why we're doing it. Because ultimately we're so afraid of love that we must deny the power of our mind at all costs. And that's what we bring to Jesus. And he says, you don't have to worry about the power of your mind. You cannot kill God. You cannot even, your mind and God's mind, the ego mind and God's mind will never meet. Completely different. The ego mind is the little tennis ball, and God's mind is the Empire State Building. There's nothing really happens to the mind of God that we can make here in this world. All right, so this was the end of part 1. Next time, we're going to talk about one specific problem that we're making, which is physical symptoms. Thanks.